Delighted you are here with us this morning for gospel resurrection narratives by looking at Mark's gospel, chapter 16, 1 through 8. And from that particular narrative, we focused on the messenger and what he had said to the women who had come to anoint the body of Jesus. We looked specifically at verses 6 and 7, in which the messenger says to the women, "Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. See the place where they laid him. But go and tell his disciples and Peter, he's going ahead of you into Galilee, and there you will see him just as he told you." And the question we asked last Sunday was this: what was the significance of Galilee? Galilee was the place where Jesus had called them. And it's the place where he was going to call them again. You see, following the resurrection, it was now time to regroup. It was now time to start over. Galilee was going to be the place where Jesus resurrected their self-worth and resurrected their dreams. It would be the place where Jesus would model compassion and grace, showing to his disciples the power of redeeming love. In short, Easter is about starting over. And certainly if anybody needed the opportunity to start over, well, it was the disciples. He's going ahead of you into Galilee. I want to establish the setting for our gospel reading on this Sunday. It seems that Peter and some of the other disciples are in Galilee, and Peter tells them, "You know what, guys, I'm going out to fish." And the other disciples respond by, "Well, we'll go with you." And so after all, that's what fishermen do. They fish. So they got into the boat. They fished all night. Caught absolutely nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus is standing on the shore, but the disciples don't recognize him, and he calls out to them, asking them if they'd caught any fish. And when they answered that they hadn't, he tells them to cast their net on the right side of the boat where they would find some. And sure enough, they found a lot. In fact, they found so many fish they couldn't haul the net into the boat. And suddenly John says to Peter, "It's the Lord." And upon hearing that, Peter immediately jumps into the water and swims to shore, followed by the other disciples in the boat, where they saw Jesus standing over a charcoal fire, grilling fish. And Jesus invites them to come and to have some breakfast. If you have your Bibles or New Testaments, I invite you to turn to John's Gospel. John chapter 21. We're going to begin reading in verse 15. Because John tells us that when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." And again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me. Follow me." Every time I read this text, I can't help but think to myself, poor Peter. I mean, not once, not twice, but 3 times Jesus asked Peter if he loves him. And not once, not twice, but 3 times, Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Poor Peter. You do remember Peter, don't you? Peter had just been a common fisherman when Jesus had walked by and said to him, "Come, follow me." And Peter immediately dropped his nets and everything that he'd ever known, and he followed this Jesus of Nazareth. And with Jesus walking the road together, Peter had seen great things. He'd seen unbelievable things, miraculous things, incredible healings, acts of power, acts of grace. You do remember Peter, don't you? But you see, he was the most impulsive of all the disciples. As I've said time and again, it was Peter who would speak first and then engage his brain. You do remember Peter, don't you? You remember when the disciples saw what they thought was a ghost walking on the water? It was Peter who said, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." And Jesus responded by simply saying, "Come on." You may remember it was also Peter whom Jesus took along with John and James to the mountain to pray, in which Jesus was transfigured. And as you might have guessed, it was Peter who, as they were leaving, said to Jesus, "Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." You do remember the time when Jesus and the disciples were walking along, and Jesus asked the disciples, he said, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered, "Well, some say you're John the Baptist, others say you're Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." And then Jesus gets real personal. For he looks at the disciples and he said, "What about you? Who do you think that I am?" And you can almost see the disciples with heads down, shuffling their feet nervously. When Peter finally speaks up and says, "What? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." It was Peter about whom Jesus said the following, following the confession of Peter, said, "Peter, you are the rock upon which I will build my church." You remember Peter, don't you? It was Peter who, when Jesus told them that they would all fall away on account of him, it was Peter who said, "Listen, even if everybody falls away on account of you, I never will." And finally, it was Peter who said, when Jesus told him that he had prayed for him, that his faith wouldn't fail him, it was Peter who said, "Lord, I'm ready to go with you to prison. I'm ready to go with you even to death." Now, say what you will about Peter, but you do have to admit that Peter was the one disciple who, above all else and all others, was at least earnest in his devotion. He loved Jesus. He was devoted to Jesus. And yet, when it came down to it, Peter, just like so many of us, was unable to live up to his own values and his own ideals. Because you see, when the hour of Jesus' betrayal and death came, Peter didn't exactly stand bravely by Jesus' side. Instead, Peter chose to anonymously warm himself by a charcoal fire. The unfortunate thing is you just simply cannot warm feet that have gone cold. And not only that, he did not go unnoticed like he had hoped. Because you see, 3 different times he was asked by someone who was there, wait, you know him, don't you? And 3 different times he said, no, I don't know him. I have no idea what you're talking about. You see, he loved Jesus. Yet in Jesus' hour of need, Peter denies that he even knows him. In other words, Peter was tested and found lacking. Peter was tested and wasn't quite up to the challenge. Poor Peter. Now let me ask you this. How could Peter have been filled with anything but unfiltered remorse and guilt and regret and self-loathing? How in the world could Peter even live with himself after what he had done? I've often wondered how many times that Peter replayed those hours in his head, those hours wishing beyond hope that he could go back and change them. How many times has Peter wanted to be able to go back and rewrite his past? How many times do you think Peter wanted to go back and actually be the man that he wished he was or wished he had been? My guess is when Peter jumps into the sea, swims to shore, and encounters Jesus on the beach, grilling fish over a charcoal fire, my guess is that the smell of that charcoal fire may very well have triggered the memory of yet another charcoal fire. A charcoal fire around which he warmed himself with his own self-protection and fear. Denying his Lord and warming his hands, his own smell of shame. I mean, have you ever stopped to think about that? The boldest, perhaps most devoted, most impulsive of all the disciples, where if there was a brag to be made, Peter was going to make it. If there was a feat to be accomplished, Peter was going to accomplish. Can you possibly imagine how he must have felt when the cock crowed the 3rd time and he realized he'd failed? Warmed himself beside a charcoal fire, only now to be standing on shore with Jesus, who's grilling fish over a charcoal fire. But here's the thing. In that moment, the resurrected Christ does such an unbelievable, loving, and merciful thing. Notice when Peter gets to shore and Jesus invites him and the other disciples to have breakfast, notice Jesus does not rebuke Peter for failing him in his time of need. Not at all. Instead, what does he do? He gives Peter breakfast. And then he gives Peter 3 chances to proclaim his love. One time for each of his denials. Do you love me, Peter? With the smell of charcoal in his nostrils, could Peter have possibly answered yes, without also feeling tears swelling up in the corners of his eyes? I failed you, Lord. I denied you in your hour of death, despite everything within me that I knew was wrong. But yes, 3 times, yes, I love you, Lord. Have mercy on me. Here's another question for us to think about. What do we mean when we say, Lord, have mercy? Some may say we're asking God not to punish us for our sins. In other words, God, we don't want you to bring down your fury and violent retribution on us. And perhaps there is a place for that. But also, maybe asking for God's mercy is like saying, we beg you for your mercy to be with us because ours is not enough. God, we ask for your wisdom to be with us for your loving kindness to be with us because we just don't have enough in and of ourselves. God, we keep messing everything up. Perhaps that's why we ask God for mercy. Because we realize our own limitations. We realize we do not have the answer to all the questions. And it seems to me that perhaps we are especially moved to beg God for mercy in situations where we are overwhelmingly aware of our own shortcomings and our own smallness. In times where terrible things happen and we still have to go on with our lives. Those times in the living of our lives where terrible things happen and we simply have to cling tightly to the truth that God can redeem that time, that circumstance, that situation. It's not to minimize the need for justice. It is, however, to say that God is a God of Easter. That is, that He is a God of starting over. The adjective so often coupled with the word mercy is the word tender. Tender mercies. But here's the thing, folks. God's mercy is not always tender. Sometimes His mercy is kind of like a blunt hammer, which I'm certain Peter must have felt when being questioned by Jesus on this particular morning. Mercy is not meant to wrap a warm, limp blanket around those who are offenders. Rather, God's mercy is the kind that kills the thing that wronged it and resurrects something new in its place. Granted, in our guilt and remorse, we may wish for nothing but the ability to rewrite our own past. But what we've done will not, indeed, what we've done cannot be undone. It's there. But here's the good news. Here's the good news on this first Sunday after Easter. That good news being that in the mercy of God, what you and I have done can nevertheless be redeemed. And it's often the truth of God's ability to redeem us that I cling to more tightly than anything else. Because you see, I have to. I need to. Indeed, I want to. For when we say, Lord, have mercy, what else could we possibly mean than that particular truth? That which we have done, the circumstances in which we find ourselves, as painful as they might be, as abhorrent as they might be, are nevertheless circumstances and situations that can be redeemed. Easter is about starting over. And that's exactly why Jesus said, tell Peter. I like that. The message. Tell the disciples and Peter that I'm going to Galilee ahead of them. And I'll meet them there. Why would he make that statement? Because Jesus knew that of all the disciples that were going to need his presence and his redeeming grace, his mercy, he knew that of all the disciples that would need it the most, it was going to be Peter because of what Peter had done. To say, Lord, have mercy, is to put our hope, your hope, my hope, in the redeeming work of the God of Easter, as though our very lives depend upon it. Because truth be told, they do. It means that we're an Easter people. It means that we are a people who know the resurrection. Especially in and among the least likely people and the least likely places. We know that it's through those things that God redeems even the biggest messes that you and I may have made in life. Peter's, mine,